This episode is brought to you by Hasa. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over some reasons why your saltwater generator is not producing chlorine, and I'll cover some of the more common ones and also some of the ones that aren't quite as common. And this applies somewhat to pools with zero chlorine as well that aren't saltwater generated, or don't have a saltwater generator, I should say. But this is more specifically for those pools with a saltwater generator or salt system. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy Coaching Program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support. From me, I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. Probably one of the most obvious reasons why the saltwater pool is not producing chlorine is that the salt cell is not operating properly. There are a few factors that will cause the salt cell not to operate properly. The first one and foremost is if there's calcium buildup on the plates. Even if you're not getting an indicator from your system saying to clean the cell, because some of them do indicate that they'll have a warning or a warning light that says your cell is dirty. By the way, if you have a Hayward Aquarite system, every 3 months or 90 days, the light will come on, inspect cell light will come on automatically as a way for it to remind you to check the salt cell to make sure that it's clean. It's a little bit annoying that that's built into the system, at least the older software. That happens a lot. You just have to reset it by holding that little black diagnostic button down for 5 seconds. So just be aware of that little thing with the Aquarite salt system, the Hayward Aquarite systems. Pentair will also warn you if the salt cell is dirty. And then, of course, the Jandy True Clear, you can look through the clear lid and see any calcium buildup on the salt cell. But even if you're not getting a clean cell warning, there's a possibility that there's enough calcium buildup on that cell, on the cell plates, to cause it not to produce chlorine at a sufficient level. So, of course, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the salt cell is clean. And that's the first thing that I always do when I get to a pool and the salt system is not really producing chlorine. I'll clean the cell with a light mixture of water, turmeric acid, and you can refer to your specific cell's owner manual for the acid to water ratio. You don't want to, of course, put too much acid in there because that will ruin the plates of the cell. So the salt cell being dirty is one of the primary reasons why it's not producing chlorine, and it could be as simple as that, and that's all you have to do is clean the salt cell, and then everything will be operating again. Another problem that I've noticed with these systems is that the salt level and sometimes the indicator on the actual panel is not accurate for the salt level in the pool. Pick on Hayward again. Their Aquarite systems sometimes give you a false low reading, and that causes the pool or the system not to create the chlorine that's necessary for your pool. And that's usually because the salt cell is dying, and I'll cover salt cells going bad as well. So I always recommend having a digital salinity meter with you so you can measure the amount of salt in the water. I find these to be much more reliable. You can get one on Amazon for like $30, but you can also invest in a professional quality one like the Hawk system or the Lamotte tester for salinity. Always good to have that to check the salt level. because these systems need at least 2,800 parts per million of salt in the water, or salinity, to operate. So if it's below 2,800, a lot of times it's not going to produce chlorine, and some systems won't even warn you that the salt is low. Some will say low salt, and that'll warn you that it's low, and it can't really do the generating process with that low salt because it needs that salinity level at a certain point to produce the chlorine in the pool. And some systems will work with low salt. They'll just produce less chlorine. It'll be, a slower production. But a lot of systems just won't produce any chlorine with the low salt. So you want to check the salt level and make sure that it's indicating it's at 2,800 parts per million or higher. 3,000 parts per million is probably the sweet spot for most systems. And the highest you want to go is about 3,400 parts per million, because then you're getting into the point where the high salt level will also cause it not to produce chlorine in the pool. Sometimes you'll clean the salt cell of a Pentair and telechlor cell, and then you're going to get a high salt indicator. And that happens sometimes, and it won't be producing during that period of time. And I find that will eventually recalibrate itself, and the high salt indicator will turn off. But if you do have a salt system with a high salt indicator, it's not going to produce chlorine either. So the salt has to be within that range, the 2,800 to 3,500 parts per million, for it to be effectively producing chlorine for your pool. So just keep that in mind. Understand that this is a pretty major factor in if the salt cells can actually work or not, is the salt level. And I typically will check the salt level in my area in April, beginning of May, when the season's starting. Because another reason that the salt system is not producing chlorine is that the water is too cold. So if you check the salt level like in February or March when the system's not even running, it really doesn't do any good. You can't really add salt to the pool, or you could add salt to the pool, but it's not going to be generating chlorine anyway. So I usually wait till April or beginning of May when the water temperature is warm enough in my area for the salt system to generate. So that's another reason why the salt water systems won't make chlorine. If the water gets too cold, typically when it's in the low 60s, most systems will turn off the production, and you're not going to be able to generate chlorine because it just doesn't conduct properly in cold water. So if you're wondering, like in January, February, if you're in Southern California and your salt system is it says cold or something, and it's not making chlorine, or your chlorine level is not indicating that it's working, it's because of the cold water. In that case, it won't work in really cold water, and therefore you just have to substitute it with liquid chlorine. And that's a great way to kind of sanitize your pool in the winter. I also like putting a floater in with the trichlor tablet so that I can release some cyanuric acid into the pool, and that's something that you're going to need in the summertime. So one tablet and a floater, every couple of weeks is pretty good in the winter for the salt systems that aren't producing chlorine, and you're adding some cyanuric acid to the water. So that's a benefit as well in the summer when you're going to need cyanuric acid. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. One thing I mentioned earlier was the salt cell dying, and the lifespan of the cells vary depending on how often they're run or how long they're run with the system. And you could usually get about 3 to 5 years out of a salt cell before you start to have a problem. And each system's a little bit different. The Hayward Aquarite system will indicate low salt a lot when it's not really low, and that's because the salt cell is near the ending its lifespan. The Pentair system, usually it'll work up until it gets to about 20% of the life of the cell, and then it'll just not work. You'll have different lights that may blink, and that indicates that the salt cell is not working. You may clean it, and it may say that it's still dirty, or it may have a flashing light for high salt or something like that, and that it just indicates that the salt cell is near the end of its lifespan. You can, of course, take it in to be tested at a pool store, and that's a good way to test it. I also like carrying extra salt cells. When you replace a salt cell, It's good to have a salt system or a salt cell that you can actually put in if you have a lot of Pentair cells, and you can test the system to see if your spare cells operating the system. You can also do certain tests for it. There's also an indicator on the screen of the IntelliChlor system. You just hold the more button down for 3 seconds. If the light is a light will come on and indicate 20%. That means that you're near the end of the light. If there's 2 lights, you're at 40%. If there's 3 lights, you're at 60. 4 lights, you're at 80. And that's kind of how you test that. You can also check the voltage. Again, take it into a pool store or your supplier, and they can check it for you to see if it's actually working. The Hayward aquatic systems will actually have the voltage displayed on the screen, and you can call Hayward and talk to them and give them those numbers, and they can walk you through if the cell is still good or not. And other cells, like the iChlor, has a indicator with the lifespan on there as well. And some cells just don't have any indicator, but they'll have an error code that pops up when they're at the end of their life. So if you're getting like a low salt constantly, like with the Hayward, sometimes with the Pentair system, then more than likely that salt cell is getting near the end of its lifespan and it has to be replaced for the pool to operate, for the system to operate correctly at that point. And then there are the odd problems. I've had a Pentair system, or actually a few Pentair systems, where the cells, the plates in the cell actually crack a little bit and chip off, and that also causes not to produce chlorine. So those plates have to be intact for it to work properly. So keep that in mind as well. If they're not intact, chances are it's not going to produce chlorine, and it's going to indicate something like low salt or dirty cell continuously. Sometimes that sensor gets messed up in the IntelliChlor cells too, and sometimes a double quick acid bath resets that sensor. And I've had these cells also say the cell is dirty after cleaning it. Sometimes it just resets on its own and you don't have to worry about it. And then the flow sensor also, I've had a lot of Hayward systems where a rodent chews the flow sensor wire. Really simple, you'll see the flow light flashing red, and the flow sensor could be bad. Pentair had a really bad run of flow sensors as well, and you had to replace those on a lot of Pentair systems. The Hayward ones, usually when the wire is broken, you're going to get that flow sensor error with the red light. So the flow sensor is really important because the cell won't activate or produce chlorine if it's not getting flow, or it doesn't think it's getting flow through the cell. And the flow sensor is how it detects how much water is passing through the cell, just to protect the system, protect the cell from trying to generate chlorine with no water in there, because that can cause the cell to actually explode. And if you go to Facebook, you'll see some pool guys and gals post these photos of salt systems where the cell has exploded. And a lot of times that's because the flow sensor probably failed and there was no water in there. Or sometimes they're turning on when the system is actually off, and this also causes that problem. Speaking of flow, one other issue that you may have is if the filter is dirty, you're not getting enough flow to the system, then that would also cause the salt cell not to produce, because there's not enough flow, not enough water flowing to the system. And it's something that you have to also be aware of, that it needs a certain amount of RPMs if you have a variable speed pump. Typically, if it's not at 1800 RPMs, anything lower than that, 1600 or 1500, there's not going to be enough flow going through the salt cell to activate it to produce the chlorine. So keep that in mind, that if you are running it on a VS pump, you have to have at least 1800 RPMs in most cases for that salt cell to activate and start producing the chlorine in the pool. And if you don't, there's not enough flow going to it, and that will stop it from producing the chlorine as well. So here are some basic other reasons why the salt system may not be producing chlorine. Number one, your run time. So if you're not running the pool long enough, it may not be producing enough chlorine. If you look at the manual of your salt system, it'll say, like for instance, the Pentair IC40 cell will make 1.4 pounds of chlorine per day, but this is at 100% output with the pump running 24 hours a day at the full speed of the pump. So if you're running your pool 5 hours a day at 2600 RPMs, let's say, you're not going to produce 1.4 pounds of chlorine. And if you have a 25,000 gallon pool, you're not going to be producing enough chlorine. So you have to boost that up. What I recommend doing, if you think that you're not running your pool long enough to produce the chlorine, is just set it for 100% output. Set your variable speed pump to full speed. at 3450 RPMs, and then run it 24 hours to see if it produces 1.4 pounds of chlorine. How will you know? Well, the pool should have a pretty high chlorine level after that 24-hour period, because that's equivalent to about 1.5 gallons of liquid chlorine, which in a 25,000 gallon pool will raise it up, 8 to 10 parts per million. So you should get a good indicator at that point. So not running the pool long enough is a factor in the system not producing enough chlorine. Again, those numbers in the manual are based on 100% output, running the pool 24 hours a day at 100% power. And if you are running it less, you're going to get less chlorine generated, and you're going to have to figure out, how long you should run your pool based on the size and what percentage of output. And again, the percentage of output is also something that you want to consider. If you're running it at 60% or 50% output, that means that about half the time it's not generating chlorine while the pump is running, and half the other time it is. So you want to also make sure you have the output set accordingly. So I would say, again, do that test 24 hours, running it at 100% output at full speed to see how much chlorine it produces. And you can kind of taper it down. You go to 12 hours at 2600 RPMs, and you could dial the output down to 50%. And this is where the salt system has a little bit of problems. When you try to set it to the right output, you have to calculate the runtime, the speed of the pump based on if it's a variable speed pump, and what percentage of chlorine output you want to set the system to get that kind of sweet spot of production. And it's one of the most difficult things to do with a saltwater system. You either have too much chlorine or too little chlorine being produced. But if you know your pools on your route, you'll be able to start dialing in these systems and getting the salt production at the right level. It's just a matter of playing with the system. And I always err on running the system more than running the pool longer to get that more consistent chlorine production, and then I kind of dial it down at that point. But these are some of the main reasons why your saltwater system is not producing chlorine. I didn't touch on anything with the pool itself, like the cyanuric acid level, which I'll do in a second part here, where I'm going to talk more in general about why a pool may be zeroing out or not holding chlorine. And this is applicable to saltwater generators too, but it's nothing with the system itself, which I've covered here. It's nothing to do with the salt cell or the flow, because if you're using trichlor tablets or liquid chlorine, that's not a factor. And if you're looking for more podcasts, and that particular one, the follow-up one here, go to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com, click on the podcast icon there, and there'll be a drop-down menu of over 1,800 podcasts for you there. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.